Hi there, welcome back. This audio is slightly less than our usual quality because we had to, for various reasons, record this over Zoom. I encourage you to plough through the slightly less quality audio because what Dr. Mark Stevens has to say is worth the effort. So plough on and enjoy. Well, welcome back to our podcast exploring the books of 1 and 2 Samuel in parallel with our Sunday teaching series. Glad you've found your way back here. Hope that these have been helpful. Our guest today is Dr. Mark Stevens, who preached for us a couple of weeks ago. It's great to have you with us. Welcome, Mark.
It's good to be here, Keith.
Fantastic. And lots of great feedback about your sermon and all the sermons unpacking 1 and 2 Samuel so far, which is great. And we're encouraging people to write their questions in our Q&A sessions after our 10 o'clock service, and those that we don't get to or we want to dive a little bit deeper into, where we're supplementing that with this podcast. So I'm hoping this is helping you with your journey through 1 and 2 Samuel and your own relationship with God, whether it's in your small group or your quiet times. And so we've got a bunch of questions, Mark. So buckle up, mate, because
Sure.
we're going to dive in and some really good questions. So let's explore first. There's a bunch of questions around this theme. Does God actually regret making Saul king over Israel? That's the language that's used in 1 Samuel 15. The question is, does he actually regret making him king, given that he is all-knowing and sovereign?
Yeah, this will probably be a version of the answer that I gave on the Sunday, which is to say, first of all, the words that are sometimes translated regret, sometimes translated changing your mind, or I've changed my mind, they're the same word in Hebrew. So the tension's probably actually even a little greater, whereas English translation sometimes actually changes the expression. In Hebrew, it's actually the same word, which reflects the fact that Hebrew often is using one word in multiple ways. I think the essence is that, first of all, I don't actually understand what it's like to be God. And so I don't actually understand what is it like to feel and engage and interact with the world relationally, whilst at the same time being in complete sovereign control over it. That's an experience I will never have. And therefore, how to hold those two things together, the scriptures always seem to be holding more than one thing together. That feels sometimes like it's in tension, but is not trying to be portrayed as contradictory. And I think here, the scriptures are very clear that God is sovereign. God knows what is coming. He knows, and he also he's in control of those events. And yet at the same time, God is always relating to his world. He is never distant from his world, just simply moving the chess pieces. And I think that word is trying to capture the fact that although God knows what is going to happen with Saul, there is a genuine grief, if you will, a genuine disappointment, a genuine lament, all of which are human terms that I'm applying to God. And so they don't apply in the same way that they do in my life.
Yes.
But they are terms that are trying to reflect the fact that God genuinely cares for his creation and genuinely is grieved, I think is a fair word to say, when we sin and when we rebel against his purposes.
Yeah, that's really helpful. There's something about our human limitation to understand, a fully transcendent God that's involved here, isn't there? That on the one hand, regret or changing our mind is meant to help us to try and understand something that's true of God. And yet on the other hand, it's not exactly the same, as you pointed out, as our experience of changing our mind or regret. We can't map our human experience of those words or emotions and say that's exactly what God is like. It's true, but not comprehensively true. I'm sort of reminded of is it Calvin, who talks about God sort of condescending in his revelation to us, like a nursemaid speaks to a child with a lisp. That was his context. So that here is a good instance of that, and you see that sort of all over the scriptures as well. That tension between what we can know of God truly, and yet not know about him comprehensively, because we're finite minds trying to understand an infinite being.
Yeah. And the fact is that my experiences of regret are nearly always because of my lack of knowledge. So, as in that I regret doing something because if I'd known the end from the beginning, I wouldn't have done it. But that's not an experience I can have. And whenever we push and only have the control part, or we only have the emotional reaction part, we're actually missing something of the full portrait of who our God is. And there are just frequent moments when I sit there and go, I can affirm both truths without fully understanding what that is like.
Yes. Yeah. And so that speaks to our approach to the scriptures, isn't it? We've got to come, if they are the word of God, we come with humility, seeking understanding, which will, we can understand. It's written in human words. We use human reading techniques to, understand that sort of stuff. But there are limits to how comprehensively we can know God. Now we know in part, then we will know in full, that sort of thing. Yeah. All right. Thanks for that. That's a good start. We're off and running. Fantastic. Okay. I think we touched on this on the Sunday as well, but let's just come around to it again, because it's a big question. There are a number of questions about it. It is a question that sort of gets thrown at Christians as well, about the violence in the Old Testament. So the question here is about, how would you think of God in the light of the command to wipe out another nation with violence? How can God love everyone? What about the Amalekites? Did God love them too? So what can we say about that?
Yeah, there's a range of questions there. Let me see if I can work through them in order of some description. The question of innocence and guilt, I think there's a couple of things we want to work through there. I want to be careful about when I portray someone as innocent and someone as guilty on the basis of corporate actions, and so everyone perishing in the flood. The clear implication of what the text is saying is that the whole earth was corrupt to that point, and therefore this is a just action of God. And so there's not trying to draw that there aren't distinctions between, some people have been heinously sinful and some people have been less heinously sinful, but everyone in Adam is guilty. And so I want to be careful about the ways that I think through guilt and innocence. That doesn't necessarily take away the tension. The second thing is the way the Old Testament works is that kind of final judgment and present judgment kind of overlap, in the sense that instead of waiting for the end, things are happening in the middle of time. But there are times when I think present judgment happens when I'm not quite sure that is a final judgment on the person, but on all people, but it's a present indication of what God is going to do in order to restore order within his creation. And so there are times when I see people get presently judged, and I sit there and go, I'm not quite sure that is a case of determining their eternal destiny or not. I don't know if Scripture speaks to that. I just kind of hold out a question mark there. So I think on those two issues, I acknowledge the tension. I want to acknowledge the tension, but I also want to say that there's a dimension of things that I don't know that are in the divine courtroom that I entrust to the character of the God who I see throughout the whole of Scripture.
Yeah.
And that's whenever you come to problem of evil questions, it's always about, well, what is God like typically? What is God like as a pattern across the scriptures? What is the God I see, or who is the God I see revealed in the person and work of Jesus? And does that lead me to trust when there's things where I've got question marks and I may not actually have all the info? And I think that's one of those moments where I sit there and go, there's a tension there. But the reason there's a tension is because I know who my God is across the whole of the storyline.
Yes.
So that'll be the first thing. I don't know if you wanted to chime in on that.
No. That's all really helpful. The question of innocent. We're getting back to our view versus kind of God's view, and we're not God. So at one level, we want to submit to the one who is God because he's God, and we're not. But then you go, is this a God worth submitting to? Is this a God I want to give up that kind of power and control to? Is he trustworthy? And there we're back. You helpfully mentioned the personal work of Jesus is the center of the revelation. And there, of course, the violence of God's judgment, the wrath of God, falls on another instead of us, and that is the character. And so that then you read the scriptures in the light of the center of the revelation. I think you're right there. I was intrigued by that comment. I'm wondering if our listeners might have the question that popped into my mind when you say, when I see people judged presently. Could you give an example of what you think might that look like?
So, for example, what do I do with, just to really go very difficult circumstances, what do I do with David and Bathsheba's child? What do I do with Ananias and Sapphira? That's probably a little bit harder. But I guess when I see these kinds of moments of immediate judgment, I'm hesitant to always kind of sit there and go, is this just simply God? Like, take, for example, the story of Ananias and Sapphira, which I have no dog in the fight about trying to determine where their eternal destiny is. Yes. But that's very clear that is a judgment of God that's somewhat peculiar in the New Testament.
Yeah.
But where it's very important in the early days of the church that kind of judgment has happened. And therefore, there's the two things don't necessarily overlap. I even think of the passage in 1 Corinthians 3 of the leader who was built poorly. So there's a picture of a leader. Have you built with gold, silver, and precious stones, or have you built with wood, stubble, and straw, or something like that? Is it whatever? Poor materials versus, and that there's an image of the person will still be saved, but as one escaping through the fire because their work has been terrible. Now that's a different thing, because that's a picture of final judgment. But
I wonder. I was just thinking 2 Samuel 6, because I'm working on it for this Sunday.
Oh, right, okay.
You have Uzzah reaching out and stopping the ark falling off the wagon, and he passes away. You go, well, is that God's final verdict on his life? Probably not, but we don't know. But that might be another example. Yeah,
exactly. So I think there are numerous moments where this present judgment within the frame of the storyline in the middle of the story are serving more purposes than just declaring someone's eternal destiny. It's actually about, in order for God to progress his purposes, he uses these methods, but then the individual before God, I don't know.
Yep.
And because I don't necessarily know that Scripture declares on it.
Yep.
I'm not saying that to say that all these people will be in the new creation with us. It's just I'm trying not to go beyond the Bible when I'm not sure about it.
Yeah.
I'll pick up on the violence thing, which is the other part of the question, and so that people don't think I'm dodging. The violence is hard, but the violence is hard throughout the whole Bible. I mean, I'm a scholar of Revelation is my main area of research expertise, and it is a violent book in terms of as it depicts judgment. And in some respects, the violence reflects the fact of judgment requires a profound intervention. It requires a profound tearing down of those who have been in corrupt power. It requires a just verdict, and we might be uncomfortable with that, except that the vast majority of people I see, I find our culture longs for justice, but not for judgment. But then when we really want justice and it doesn't happen, we really actually want judgment. We really want massive intervention. And so part of it's about how serious do we regard the state of the world. There are some tricky things with Old Testament violence, and lots of people have written on this question. A resource I would recommend to people would be something like Chris Wright's The God I Don't Understand, which sounds like an unfaithful title, but it's not. It's actually an Old Testament scholar who is a wonderful Old Testament scholar, someone who really took over the mantle of John Stott in the Langham Partnership for Third World Theological Education. But he's someone who's lectured in India and around other places of the world, and he honestly faces up to the hard questions of the text and looks at them as these have to be understood within the light of God's judgment. There are some people who want to talk about the fact that these are necessary actions in a broken world, that there are things going on in ancient Near Eastern society where this is the only way to be able to move the story forward. And people who do comparisons with the ways that other nations treated one another. And so if you wanted to look at Paul Copan's work, Copan, he's another one there. There's some tricky questions. I ultimately go back to, this is God's judgment. And so this is his just judgment. He cites with the Amalekites the story of how they treated Israel in the coming out of the Exodus. This is nowhere near as common as some people think. And there is a sense in which we always need to hold the Abrahamic promise over all of these things, which is the ultimate goal of Israel is to be a light to the nations. And therefore, the ultimate heart of God is for the nations. And so therefore, within any action which looks to destroy, we're always looking at, well, how does that actually help the broader goal of serving the nations? And Israel's goal is it has to be different from the nations in order to serve the nations. And so these harsh actions are often done at moments where there's going to be a compromising of Israel being able to serve their role to the nations. But it is a big set of questions. I just find any of the answers that want to avoid that God is somehow saying this properly, I don't find them satisfying.
Yeah. All right. That's really helpful. I don't have anything to add to that. So that's really some food for thought there. Okay. Let's move on to some other questions. Why is obedience better than sacrifice? I think that's a reference to the text there where you have Saul keeping some of the sheep and the cattle who speak at an unfortunate time to give him away, so that and he says to Samuel, but it's okay. I kept them so I could sacrifice them to God, and surely that's a good thing. And Saul replies, well, no, obedience. You were asked to not do that, and so obedience is better than sacrifice. So why is that?
So the first thing to say is that within Old Testament frame, part of your obedience is to sacrifice.
Yeah, the law commands it, doesn't it? So
so there's whole books outlining, and we're studying them at my college in our sermon series right at the moment on Leviticus and the various grain offerings and fellowship offerings and burnt offerings. So there's a profound amount of material that actually says this is what you're meant to do. and make sure you do it really well. And if you don't do it well, it's a problem. So therefore, part of their obedience is sacrifice. But I think within the Old and New Testaments, there is this recognition that particularly external religious actions like that are always necessary. Like, as in, it's necessary that we gather together as God's people in the New Testament. It's necessary that we pray together. Like, as in, you can point to these external actions, but then there's always this way within the human spirit to take the things that God has given us and to kind of detach them from an obedient heart.
Yes.
Beautiful things, tithing, giving to the church. It's a beautiful, heart-filled action that you can turn into a boastful kind of piece of propaganda, or, this is what my achievements are for God. And so there are these regular reminders. This is one of them. It comes in the prophets too, and it comes in the books of the Torah, the circumcision of the heart. To obey is better than sacrifice. You look at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is always sitting there and going, there's to obey is better than a sacrifice. Well, in this case, what Samuel is saying is a sacrifice done out of keeping with what God has commanded is no longer a sacrifice, is really what he's saying. He's sitting there going, the action doesn't just carry its own magic to it.
Yeah.
Just because my Bible is open, if I read it really poorly, it's no great value. If I pray, I remember watching a show once with a guy who was praying that God would help him in his gambling. And you're kind of like going, yeah, you're almost thinking that prayer kind of is its own validation, but prayer is the language of a heart oriented to things of God. So I think it's trying to get at sacrifice carries no value unless it's within the context of an obedient heart. And an obedient heart in this case would not have done what he did.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And those sort of modern parallels, the human heart loves to make tick boxes that we can check off and then sort of show to God, look, here's all the things I did, so you owe me, or aren't I good? We love to turn things into merit. That's the pride of Adam sunk deep into our hearts. And so it's easy to turn something like, in a modern church, turn up for communion. I turned up, I did communion, I left. If that is not an expression of a heart that is broken by Christ, the need for Christ to die for me, and then joyful that he did and paid for my sin, if it's not an expression of that, and then in fellowship with others who feel the same, it's nothing. It's, you may as well have gone to 7-Eleven and drunk a Coke, or what? Like, who cares? It would have been the same significance to God. So, yeah, those signs.
I think the heart is. Some people want to play these things off against one another, that this is somehow a moment in the Old Testament which is really saying all the sacrificial stuff is just a waste of time. But if it's a waste of time, then it's a waste of time for Jesus to die for us, because he's the fulfillment of the sacrificial system. Like, it's not some anti-sacrifice moment. It's simply saying that in God's economy and God's way of calling his people to love him and serve him, there is this way that we have to detach things off. And the heart is always at the core of what God is after. If you look at the book of Romans, which I taught last semester, the sin of people in Romans 1 is about their hearts are hardened. And what happens through the gospel is that our hearts are changed by the grace of Christ and by the gift of the Spirit. And it's always a heartfelt response to God, which then flows out in these very specific actions. And the specifics matter. It matters that I give. It matters that I come to church. It matters that I take communion, but not separate from a heart.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, that's good. Very good. All right, let's go to someone was really keen and reading forward in their Bible when they were listening to you. So here's the question as it came. Does the Bible contradict itself in 1 Samuel 15 and 1 Samuel 27? They go, right. Well, so they're assuming some that we'll know or that we'll go look it up.
And of course, I knew it straight away, Keith, and didn't have to look it up myself.
Of course. I expect nothing less, brother. So what are we looking at here?
So in 1 Samuel 27, David is in his fleeing from Saul and his time with the Philistines. It talks about him when he's living in Philistine territory. This is 1 Samuel 27, verse 7. David lived in Philistine territory 1 year and 4 months. So he's in a kind of exile situation. Verse 8, now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. Brackets, from ancient times, these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. Now, of course, the question here is, David seems to be on the surface doing the same thing that Saul did, which is that he is attacking the Amalekites and not completely destroying them or completely wiping them out, but keeping some of the choice produce for himself, which seems to repeat the sin of Saul. There's a few things to note here. First of all, even though David has been at this stage anointed to be king, he is not actually functioning as the king of Israel at this point in time. He is still functioning as David, favored warrior, shepherd boy of God, but he's not actually functioning as the king. And therefore, it would be a live question for me. I don't think the text is trying to suggest that he has been specifically called to act on behalf of Israel to execute judgment on the Amalekites. So I don't think there's a generic kind of wiping out of the Amalekites for every Israelite in every interaction that they're engaging with them in. So it's something we would need to push into. Is David under the same command? There's no word in Scripture that says he's under the same command. And Saul's sin, in part, is related to his leadership role. He is the king of Israel. He is actually doing this. So actually the other men, the other soldiers, we don't know about what happened to them who actually didn't execute total and comprehensive judgment. The final thing is, and this is because I haven't worked on this text to the same degree, is I would want to be open to, as we're going to need to be open to as we look at David over the next few weeks, to be open to the fact of not everything David does is affirmed. So I'm not, off the top of my head, entirely sure whether this action of David is being held up as ambiguous or it's being affirmed or it's being whatever. So all of that to say is I think the judgment upon Saul has to do with his role and the specific commands that have been given to him. And the question of David's actions is not as acute because he's not yet in that position. And I myself am not entirely sure what the narrator thinks about his actions.
Yes, which is the warning for all of us all the time, isn't it? With Old Testament narrative, something that's described is not necessarily good or bad. You kind of got to work out how it ends up, or where it leads to sort of then read back into whether it's good or bad. And I think it's probably helpful here for us to distinguish or to recognize where this is happening in terms of the Bible's timeline and where we sit. We sit on the other side of Christ, where the commands for all believers are kind of there, and there's not a difference. We can't go, well, I'm not Saul in this situation, or I'm not David in this situation. We live in a different era. That the Christ has come, the great King has come, and has died and risen and reigns now on the throne. He's given us his Spirit to enable us to obey him, to understand his commands, and the ability to be able to obey them, albeit imperfectly until glory. But so there is a difference between our context and Saul's and David's.
Mm.
Yeah.
And there's just, I mean, the ultimate result of what happens with Saul is his rejection as king. And that's the very specific thing that kind of Samuel is really targeting. The book of Samuel is really targeting. Yes. It's about his legitimacy for the kingship and how his leadership functions. So excellent spotting. I like, and there are a couple of other occasions where there's some tension-filled moments about comparing David and Saul, and that's important to kind of push into because this isn't always clean and neat stuff.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that. I think David and Bathsheba is the classic example. How can Saul blows it by sinning, by sacrificing, thinking he's doing a good thing. There's no way David thought he was doing a good thing by sleeping with his neighbor's wife, and yet he repents and is restored. And yeah, so we're gonna have to dig into that as we go, and what to learn from that. All right, really helpful stuff, brother. Let's finish with this one. What can we learn from Saul, who was a disciple and leader, in light of rejection by his people? That's the question. What can we learn about Saul? I'm not sure he's rejected by his people. He's rejected by God, that's for sure. The kingdom is torn away from him. But I guess what can we learn from him in what we see?
Yeah, look, one of the challenges you've already hinted at it with the Old Testament is that I can't just map myself onto these characters. I'm not in the position of Saul. I'm not in the position of David. So it's not just a straight one-to-one. By the same token, there are things there that are generic to all Israelites and all believers, all members of the people of God. So I think the life of Saul is a uniquely... Let me go with the unique stuff first. It's a unique moment in the story of Israel. This is their first king. It's asked for in the wrong way. We're going to end up with kingship, but we're going to get there in a kind of roundabout way, so to speak. And there's a bunch of stuff that is peculiar to the first king and the like that is strategic for God to establish what a king is meant to look like, what a king is meant to do, how a king is meant to lead in obedience, so on and so forth. And particularly, so I think there's a bunch of stuff there that I need to be aware that this is a particular moment in salvation history. Nevertheless, I do think there's some insights, if we're careful, about what does leadership look like and what does discipleship look like. I think all of us as disciples need to pay attention to the fact that it is easy to perform religion, to perform the things of faith in ways which actually reflect that you may not actually have a relationship with God. And I do think that there are, I'm not going to go to the stake on it, but I do think there are troubling signs about Saul's relationship with God, like at a very fundamental level, like his level of the way he prays to God, the way he responds to God's commands, the way he glorifies himself rather than God on particular occasions. There are worrying signs. And yet he does a lot right. And I think that challenges us. And I did this with my small group last night, to just sit there and go, I'm actually not going to just assume you're going okay. Because of certain outward signs, I need to actually check in. You tell me what's actually going on, and ask God to search your heart about where your relationship with him is at. And that included me kind of bringing stuff up and sitting there and going, don't assume this about me. Don't assume this about me. So I think there's something about what it means to just be a disciple and to be an obvious disciple, if that makes sense, where people just assume everything's going okay and close enough is good enough. And then I think in regards to leadership, that just gets amped up even further, because I just think when you go into positions of influence, I think I mentioned this in the sermon, I just think leaders, funnily enough, leadership leads you to get asked sometimes less questions about your discipleship.
Yeah.
People assume even more. So whereas you go from being good Christian, when you go into be good Christian leader, and people just stop asking you, how's your prayer life? Because you're always at church, and you're always doing stuff, and that's just doing stuff sometimes. And so I look at the life of Saul and know my life is not the same, and yet I realize that there's this sense in which people might be shocked to realize my sin, or people might be shocked to realize, oh, Mark's actually really struggling with some stuff, and who's speaking into his life, and who's actually making sure that he's going okay.
Yep.
And I'm glad that I have people in my life who do that, but I'm just aware of that. And I think we live in an age now where we've had a pretty hard 5 years of Christian leaders falling apart on us.
Yeah.
And part of that is when I listen to some of their stories, I nearly always feel like there's a moment where I'm going, why did nobody say something there? Like there's a kind of early fall before the big fall, or early falls before the big falls. And you go, what? And you're just going, maybe because we just don't attend to, I'm not actually sure this person's right with the Lord at the moment.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think maybe part of that is we as a people are enamored with a worldly view of leaders, that of the impressiveness, right? And that's partly Saul's looks impressive. He's big. He looks like he can take it on the world. And so the people want that. They want someone who looks the part. And yes, we'll back that in. And because they're backing that, then they're not thinking of the internals, because the externals look so good. And I wonder if that's the case with so many of these leaders, where they're charismatic personalities. You know, they can speak really well. They can hold an audience. They seem to get things done, and so that's good enough. You know, we'll back that in. It looks like they're getting results for us. But the salient warning is no. I think your very simple definition is actually quite profound. You know, a Christian leader is a disciple in a position of influence. If they're not a disciple, they shouldn't be leading. But the worldly view is lead, and we'll worry about the other stuff later. But that's
you can't backfill character.
Yeah.
You can backfill skills. Like I've seen some incredibly incompetent people become competent in a job. But it's rare, maybe impossible, to actually see someone become Christ-like for the first time in the midst of leadership. It's just, it's almost like, you know, leadership will amplify what's already there. So it's challenging. And I think the fact that we feel tension with the Saul narrative, like we sit there and go, he's kind of doing okay, isn't he? I think you're meant to feel that. I think you're meant to feel some pretty substantial sympathy for him, in the sense that he's kind of getting in the ballpark, because I think that's meant to actually raise the question for you. You know, the higher you go in leadership, the more you can't just be, it's not about pure perfection, but you can't be off on something like, when God speaks, I'm listening. And when God calls me to particular things, I'm not editing, and so on and so forth. Because by this, you will save not only yourself, but also your hearer. Like, as in, you know, there's this sense of influence that means that my mistakes are going to influence the whole of the nation or the whole of the church. So I'm just challenged by, I do think Saul was doing some good stuff. That's the scary thing.
Yeah. Well, brother, this has been a joy for me to talk to you and to chew over these questions, and hopefully something of our conversation here is helpful to the brothers and sisters listening in. Thanks for your time.
Been an absolute pleasure, Keith.
All the best for the rest of your week, what lies ahead. And thank you for joining us on the podcast. And we look forward to your company once again. Have a great week.